In the early 1800s, somewhere in the mountains between Italy and France, a hunter could have ended the entire species in a single bad season. Not a subspecies, not a regional population, all of it. Every Alpine Ibex left on Earth was standing on one mountain massif, and there were fewer of them than you'd need to fill a school bus. The number most wildlife biologists now settle on is under 100 animals. That's not a rounding down for effect. That's the actual, documented low point, recorded by the naturalists and hunters who were there, and confirmed since by the geneticists who went looking for the genetic scar it left behind. And here's the part that's easy to miss. This wasn't a remote, hard-to-reach species nobody had heard of. The Alpine Ibex had lived across the entire mountain range of Western Europe for thousands of years. It's in cave paintings, it's in Roman writing, and by 1800, hunters with the new, more accurate firearms of the era had pushed it down to one mountain, one herd, one number small enough that a single hard winter could have finished the job. This is the story of how that didn't happen, twice, and why the animal you can go see in the Alps today still carries the genetic fingerprint of just how close it came. I want to start with the animal itself, because the Alpine Ibex is worth understanding before the rest of this story makes sense. Most people picture a mountain goat when they hear the word Ibex, and that's close, but not quite right. The Alpine Ibex is a true wild goat, and the males carry horns that curve backward in a long, ridged arc, sometimes over 3 feet long, close to a meter, heavier than you'd think an animal could carry comfortably on a cliff face. They live on some of the steepest terrain in Europe, often above 10,000 feet, using a hoof built with a hard outer rim and a soft, grippy pad underneath. The rim digs into rock, the pad molds around it, and together they let a 500-pound animal walk along a ledge a human couldn't stand on. The Ibex didn't just live in that terrain, it was built by it. 1. What the hunters actually wanted. Here's where the mechanism completion rule earns its keep, because hunting caused the decline is true, but incomplete. The actual mechanism is more specific and more damning. By the Middle Ages, ibex horn, blood, and internal organs were widely believed across parts of Europe to cure everything from kidney stones to epilepsy. A folk medicine belief with no basis in the animal's actual biology, but a belief strong enough to put a price on every part of the animal, not just its meat. That drove hunting pressure that had nothing to do with hunger. Add the introduction of more accurate rifles in the 16th through 18th centuries, and an animal that had survived wolves and avalanches for millennia had no adaptation at all for a threat that could reach it from 400 yards below the ledge it thought was safe. By the late 1700s, ibex were gone from Switzerland, gone from Austria, gone from France, gone from Germany. Local extinction after local extinction, valley by valley, until one mountain massif in the Italian Alps, Gran Paradiso, was the only place left where the species still existed outside of memory. Under 100 animals, one herd, one bad poaching season away from a story that would have ended completely differently. The most important part of this story hasn't happened yet. Someone actually did something about it, and it wasn't for the reason you'd hope. Movement 2, Part 1. A king's selfish decree, twice rescued from itself. In September of 1821, the King of Sardinia, Carlo Felice, issued a decree banning ibex hunting across his territory. It's tempting to tell this as a conservation hero story. It wasn't. The ibex was rare enough by then to be a status symbol, and the king wanted the last of them reserved for himself and his court, not for poachers and local hunters. Worth being clear about that motive because it matters for what comes next. A law protecting an animal for the wrong reason still protects the animal. Poaching didn't stop. It continued for decades on the Gran Paradiso massif regardless of the decree. But by the 1850s, King Victor Emmanuel II formalized the area as a royal hunting reserve, brought in a corps of dedicated game wardens, and had paths and mule tracks built through terrain that had never been systematically patrolled before. The population, protected now by people whose job it was to be there, began to climb. By the end of that century, counts on the reserve were running into the thousands. In 1922, the reserve became Gran Paradiso National Park, Italy's first national park, created specifically because of this one animal. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. Movement 2, Part 2. The second collapse. Almost nobody talks about. Here's the part of this story that gets left out of most retellings, and it's the part that makes the recovery mean something rather than just being a happy accident of royal vanity. Through the 1920s and early 30s, under an independent park commission, the Ibex population kept growing, up more than 1,500 animals in just over a decade. Then, in 1934, that commission was replaced by a centralized forestry militia run out of Rome. Local wardens who knew the terrain and the poachers by name were let go. Oversight moved to bureaucrats hundreds of miles away who had never set foot on the mountain. Then came the Second World War, and the park became a place where armies moved, and nobody was watching the Ibex at all. By 1945, the population that had once climbed past 3,000 animals had collapsed to 416. 416. After more than a century of protection, the species had come within a bad decade of being back where it started. One crisis away from extinction, for the second time, because the people actually watching over it had been sent away. This is where a man almost nobody outside Italy has ever heard of enters the story, and the way this channel found him is worth pausing on for a second, because it's exactly the kind of detail that's easy to walk past. His name was Renzo Videsott. He was a veterinarian and a mountaineer from Trento, and during the war he'd been part of the Italian resistance, running unarmed missions while the country tore itself apart. In 1945, with the war ending and the park in ruins, the anti-fascist committee in Turin gave him the job nobody else wanted: rebuild the Gran Paradiso's protection service from almost nothing, with almost no money, in mountains still full of armed men and displaced wardens. He'd once been a hunter himself, by his own account a serious one, chasing high-altitude game across the Dolomites in his younger years. What changed him, according to his own later writing, was a specific moment, watching a roe deer he'd wounded die slowly in front of him on a mountainside near Fanes. After that, by his own account, he never killed another animal in the high mountains again. The most important part of what Videsott actually did wasn't dramatic, it was arithmetic, repeated for years. Rebuilding a warden corps from scratch, rehiring the local men who knew the poachers and the terrain, personally traveling to Rome again and again to fight for funding nobody in the capital wanted to prioritize, and the country is still recovering from war. He did this for free for the first 2 years, refusing an honorary title so he could take the unpaid, hands-on job of technical director instead. Nobody planned that arithmetic in advance. It simply accumulated, valley by valley, warden by warden, for years. And the population that had crashed to 416 animals in 1945 climbed back past 3,000 within about a decade. Worth being honest about something here. The reason this story worked the second time is almost identical to the reason it worked the first time, and neither time was it really about a law on paper. Italy already had legal protection for the Ibex both times, in 1821 and again after 1922. What actually saved the species both times was somebody physically present on that mountain enforcing it. The law was necessary. It was never sufficient on its own. What actually came back and what didn't. By the 1900s, with the Gran Paradiso population secure, biologists and park managers began the slow work of reintroduction, capturing animals from that one source herd and establishing new colonies across the Alps. Into Switzerland first, beginning in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Later into France, into Austria, into Slovenia, into parts of Germany. Every single colony, every population you can go see anywhere in the Alps today traces back to that one massif and that one herd that never dropped below roughly 50 to 100 animals at its lowest point. Today, researchers with the Gran Paradiso National Park's own long-term monitoring program, working alongside university geneticists, put the total Alpine-wide population at somewhere around 50,000 animals. From under 100 to 50,000 in about 2 centuries. That's not a modest recovery. Among European wild mammals, it's genuinely one of the more complete ones on record. The next part is where the science got genuinely surprising. because a recovery this large should have erased the scars of that old bottleneck. It didn't. Here's the honest, complete version of a claim that's easy to leave half-finished. Geneticists, led by researchers including Iris Biebach and Lucas Keller, working from population genetics data on Alpine Ibex, have found that every single reintroduced population today carries unusually low genetic diversity, measurably lower than closely related wild goat species that never went through anything like this bottleneck. And the reason isn't vague. When a species drops to under 100 individuals, the animals that survive can only pass down the genetic variety that happened to exist in that small surviving group. Variation lost in the crash simply isn't there anymore to be inherited, no matter how large the population grows afterward. It's like reprinting a book from a single surviving copy with 50 pages torn out. You can print as many new copies as you want. Those 50 pages are still gone. That single fact carries a real, measurable consequence today. Follow-up research from the same Gran Paradiso population found that ibex with lower genetic diversity showed reduced fitness, traits tied to survival and reproduction, measurably worse than in more genetically diverse individuals. And in some reintroduced colonies, that same low diversity has been linked to a documented eye disease, an infectious conjunctivitis that can spread through a herd and, in bad outbreaks, cause real losses. Made worse specifically because the immune system genes that would normally help fight it off don't have much variation left to draw on. 200 years later, on faraway mountains those animals will never have seen, that old crash of under 100 survivors is still quietly shaping which ibex catch a disease and which ones don't. Step back for a second from the dates and the population counts and look at the actual shape of what happened here. A folk belief about horn and blood pushed a species down to one mountain. A king protected that mountain for reasons that had nothing to do with conservation, and it worked anyway. Bureaucrats in a distant capital nearly undid a century of that protection in about a decade. A resistance fighter turned park warden rebuilt it from 416 animals with almost no money and no fanfare. And the 50,000 ibex alive today are still, in ways you can measure in a laboratory, living with the genetic cost of how narrow that one escape actually was. That's the piece of this story that the plaques at the park entrance don't usually mention. The recovery is real, and it's also permanently marked by how close the loss came to being final. Recoveries like this one are happening in mountain ranges most people will never visit, tracked quietly by biologists whose names never make it into the guidebook. Is there a place near where you grew up or somewhere you visited where you watched something come back that people had written off as gone for good? I'd genuinely like to hear about it.